Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is a Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we do West Africa and the Sahara. African empires in West Africa are built on mostly a combination of the Niger River and a large grassland called the Sahel that stretches all the way across West Africa to basically parts of East Africa. These empires are going to have a relationship to the wider world, much like East Africa did. You got trade within Africa. You got from Africa, West Africa to North Africa, and from North Africa to the European world. When it starts, we're starting with the Roman world. There's not a lot of trade with the Greek world. There's some trade, yes, with the Phoenicians and Carthage, but it really kicks into gear when the Romans conquer North Africa. And what most of this trade is, and it will be for the next 1,000 or 1,500 years, is gold for salt. That's the big one. Gold will go north, salt will come south. And you that may sound stupid, but gold is basically coined money, so it's basically money. And salt is something you need to preserve. It's basically refrigeration plus iodine. It's medicine plus refrigeration. And if you don't have it, if you don't have the salt, you need it. You can't get along without it. And so it's worth its weight in gold, so to speak. West Africa will produce, as we talked about, Nubian cavalry. Will produce mercenaries too. Africans will go fight for the Roman world. It will also get Christianity. But it doesn't really get exported the way it does in East Africa, because the Nile is much easier to transverse. And so this ends up with being cut off in the Dark Ages from the European Christian world. So Christianity will have to be reintroduced to Africa by Europeans in the 15, 16, 1700s. But the culture that comes to stay is Islam. In the 600s, by 700 AD, Muslim armies have conquered northern Africa and conquered Spain. By 711, they've conquered Spain. And so this creates an Islamic connection for West Africa. That the Christian connection was always tenuous, but the Islamic connection is going to be real. They're real homeboys. This Islamic, European, Spanish connection. Remember, Spain from 1711 to 1492 is a Muslim kingdom, is owned by Muslims. So we get a bunch of kingdoms. And the first is Ghana. And I'm going to mispronounce this, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to go with the phonetic spelling of Wagadu from 800 to 1250. So it lasts 400 years. That's fairly successful. It's based on the upper Niger River. It's a trade empire connecting North African Berber kingdoms and Islamic Spain to Africa. That's how it makes its existence. It's like Kush. Remember, Kush is the raw material seller to Egypt, to the pharaohs of Egypt. Ghana becomes the raw material seller, the wholesaler to Islamic Spain. So we have the trade of salt for gold trade. We get leather goods go north because there's no access for the Arabs to European cows. So the Muslims don't have access to leather. And so they're going to need leather from somewhere. And so they use the African trade to get themselves leather. Because the Europeans don't want to trade with them because they're like, oh, we're at war. You're Muslims. We're Christians. Now, it's never 100% that way. There's always a little trade going on at local levels. But the idea is they just don't have access to this stuff, to European leather goods. So Ghana only has trade with the Arab world. They have trade within the African world, of course, other African kingdoms in West Africa, but their only outside connection is really through the Arab world. And all we have about them is Arab sources, what the Arabs write about them. So that's the only thing we have about what we know about this kingdom, other than we know it's successful because it lasts a long time, but it's mostly Arabs writing stuff down about, hey, there's this kingdom in Africa called Ghana. They had matrilineal kings. Kings are decided by who the mother is, who the mother's family is. So we get a centralized state, but we also get a decentralized vassal states. So the kingdom, the central kingdom, is strong, but it makes these alliances and has vassal states that get to run themselves. In some ways, this is like the Persian Empire. I could be more or less wrong is how I understand it. People who are experts in both kingdoms might quibble with that. But the idea is the Persians are plenty centralized, but they don't make other people become Persian. They say, hey, Babylonians will run Babylon, and as long as you stay loyal, we're cool. There's sources that say that they have a 200,000 person army and 40,000 archers. 200,000 infantry and 40,000 archers. And Ghana gets the name Ghana because it's the name for war chiefs. So it tells you that Ghana is a warrior place, despite all this trade. Those numbers are probably very high. It's probably 200,000 might be all the people who lived in the neighborhood of military age. In the ancient world, you don't get much higher than 20, 30,000 troops. You just don't. The Persians are the exception, and we talked about why they're an exception. But usually you get, so if you just cut them down to 20,000 infantry and 4,000 archers, you have a good-sized army. That is a nice-sized army for the ancient world, no matter who's got it. At this point, European armies are not 20,000 strong. The army of William the Conqueror in 1066 is not, who's a contemporary of this period, is not 20,000 troops. So it tells us something about the wealth and the power of Ghana. It's also a cosmopolitan trading state connecting Africa to the Islamic world. We kind of talked about that. What they do is they bring in Islamic scholars. Ghana knows it's behind. The Ghanese kings know that they're rich, but they're dumb in terms of civilization. And so what they do is catch up. They bring in Islamic scholars to improve government, improve law, improve taxation. And it's success. In fact, in their capital cities, they had 12 mosques. You don't have 12 mosques unless, one, it's a big city. Two, you've got money. Three, you have architects, which means higher education, being able to build all this stuff. And Ghana is basically converted to Islam by 1150. It's good for business. It's good for government. It ties you into the larger economic and cultural world. So it's good. The role of their kings are as lawgivers and judges. They are not necessarily, despite Ghana being the name for a war chief, they're not necessarily a war chief. It's not necessarily their job for the kings to fight on the front lines. They're lawgivers. They're judges. They're accessible, which means if you had a problem, you could communicate with the king. You could access the king. You could ask for an appointment with the king. This is much more typical of a nomadic chief than, say, a pharaoh. Pharaohs are not accessible. Roman emperors for a while, for like the first 100 years, make the argument that they're accessible. Of course, some of them you don't really want to be accessible to. But after the coming of Diocletian, they become what's called the dominate, where You never get an interview. You barely ever see the emperor at all. So this is a very personal leadership, but they are clearly kings. They are not chiefs. They have the wealth, they have the power, they have the army. They are clearly not. So it's this hybrid on the way to being like separate kings. Now, this tells you what they valued as legitimacy. They wanted personal, popular consent. They wanted the people to like them. That's why they're accessible. That's why they're a lawgiver. They want to be seen as fair. That's why they're a judge. They're the final arbiter. It's not only power, I get to decide, but it's also the ability to be like, hey, I'll solve this problem. I'm the problem solver. I'm going to make everybody like me. So it's a very accessible, very personal way of running things, which different philosophers over time think is a good idea. Like Plato wanted no city should be bigger than 10,000 people because otherwise you would stop knowing each other. So why does Ghana decline? And the answer is we don't know. We literally do not know. There seems to be a series of weak kings. The vassal states on the edges start to declare their independence. We see this happen all over the place, China and India and the Persian Empire. Eventually what happens is North Africa intervenes. The Almoravids, a caravan tribe, a Berber tribe, who will take over Spain, decide they don't like that Ghana has a monopoly, because Ghana, by having a monopoly on African trade going to Spain, going to Morocco and Spain, of course, raises the prices. Makes sense. It's how things work. You get the efficiency of having one place to go to, but you get the problem of it costing more. And so the effect is they marched an army down, beat up Ghana, broke it into pieces that then would have to negotiate a lower price, because they would negotiate with Spain, with Almoravid Spain, a lower price. So the Berbers in Spain, the Muslims in Spain, get their resources cheaper, which is nice. They don't have to worry about a strong state to their south, because the West African kingdoms, the successor states, are just going to fight along with each other. And what happens is Ghana is eventually absorbed by one of those successor states, the country of Mali, M-A-L-I. And they're going to absorb it without destroying it. They're just going to kind of swoop in and just absorb this whole thing through marriages, alliances, and economics. Kind of like, I don't know, it's just absorption, osmosis. Slowly, Ghana just kind of gets absorbed into Mali. It's not a death and destruction type of thing. So that brings us to Mali. Now, Mali will exist also in some form for 400 years, from 1235 to 1670. So this is a clearly medieval kingdom, whereas Ghana, it goes from 800 to 1200, give or take, is a Dark Age kingdom that is a late classical, early medieval kingdom that goes into the Middle Ages. Mali is clearly a Middle Ages kingdom that is beginning to get into the early modern period, which we define kind of as post like 1520 or so, 1500, 1520. They dominate the Western Sahel and the Niger River. Okay, they are more rooted than Ghana is in this region. They're going to set down more cities. They're going to set down 400 cities, so they're more settled here. The Ghana was basically a trade association. It had a king, it had an army, but it was basically this association. Whereas Mali is much more settled. It's going to lay down cities. Timbuktu and Goa are going to be the two big ones. So we're going to talk about both of these cities later. They had 90,000 infantry was the story. And these were self-armed javelin. Like they brought their own javelins with them, and they would shoot bows. They had a citizen militia. They're a citizen militia like a Greek polis. So you're having a bunch of poor dudes who show up and are now working together. These farmers all working together. So they have a javelin and a bow. There's 3 massive gold mines in Mali, and they are going to send that money to Spain. They're going to trade with Spain, and Spain always needs. The Romans looted Spain. The Romans dug up everything out of Spain, and so whoever controls Spain always needs gold. And so again, we're back to that relationship. Mali now controls the gold trade to Morocco, to Spain. Islamic Spain is at war with Christians, European Christians, but also Spanish Christians. So they're in constant need of gold to buy equipment, to hire mercenaries, to pay their troops. So all of this money, all of these goods come into Mali, and that makes Mali rich. And Timbuktu becomes an Islamic center. It gets a great library. So it becomes one of the great learning centers in the world. It becomes basically an African university. Now, it's not the first African university. That's going to be in North Africa. But it becomes basically the first, if I'm not mistaken, sub-Saharan or black African university. And it will have over 700,000 manuscripts. So it had a copy of basically everything written in the Islamic world. So it is a great resource of history, of poetry, of culture, of philosophy. Mali, despite having this large army, all of these cities, basically was a decentralized government. They taxed trade in exchange for local independence. So Mali doesn't need to run. The Mali kings don't need to run every little city. They're like, look, we get 10% of your trade, especially the trade with Morocco, and you could do what you want. And most people said, all right, because what they got out of that was protection. That money went to the universities. That money went to the army. That money went to the kings to provide protection. And as long as the kings were providing protection, basically it's just do what I say and I'll leave you alone. And most places are like, yeah, that's cool. And they hand over their 10% or so of sales tax. And everybody's happy. Because remember, sales tax nobody pays. I shouldn't say that. The customer pays. So I don't mind. So you tell me, I'm the government. Let's start over. I'm the government and I go to the local town and I say, look, I want 10%. The local town says, sure, no problem. The local town then goes to the merchants and says, okay, you're going to pay 10% extra because we have to give 10% to the big guy. And they say, sure, no problem. And they raise their prices 10%. So with international trade going to Morocco and Spain, it's the Moroccans and the Spanish who are paying 10% more, 15% more. Not even Mali citizens. It's all exported. That brings us to the most famous of the Mali kings, Mansa Musa, Mansa, and then his last name is Musa, Musa, from 1307 to 1337, so he rules for 30 years. This is very successful. He is a king who brings stability after civil wars. A Henry VI, Henry VII in England, a William and Mary also in England, a Henry IV in France. This is a guy who has survived the civil wars, has won the civil wars, wants stability. And everybody wants stability. It's a kind of an Octavian. And that's what he does. He pursues policies to create stability. He's so stable, he goes on Hajj, Hajj. He goes on Hajj to Mecca. Hajj is one of the rules of being a Muslim is you're supposed to go on a prayer pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life. And he goes. Now, Mecca is 3,000 miles away. So he's got to go through Central Africa, North Africa, Egypt, cross over into the Middle East, come down into Arabia, go to Mecca, and then come back. He becomes the most famous African since the Queen of Sheba. He becomes the most famous black African since the Queen of Sheba. Basically, wherever he went, everybody knew who he was, and they wanted his money, they wanted his patronage, they wanted everything about him. He was awesome. If you want an example of this, watch the song Prince Ali from Aladdin. And that's an idea of how he came into towns, how he came into cities. He was generous. He gave money. He hired poets. He hired playwrights. He hired musicians. He spent plenty of money. He brought a retinue with him of thousands of people. A king does not go alone. And so the idea was everybody liked him, just like Prince Ali. And the idea of this is West Africa is rich. It's modern, and it's part of the Islamic world. That's what the Hajj did. It announced, here we are. We may be at the end of your maps, but we're as developed as, we're not Hicks. We're as developed, we're as smart, we're as rich as you are. He hires the best and the brightest and sends them back to Africa, or brings them back with him as he goes back. So you get Mali architecture, learning, art, are all Islamic with the best and the brightest. Egyptians, North Africans, Arabs. Timbuktu becomes perhaps the most advanced Islamic city in the world once Baghdad is destroyed. Baghdad is destroyed in 1258 by the Mongols. After that, it's arguable that Timbuktu becomes the largest university city, the most advanced city in the Islamic world. And since it's in the Islamic world in the 1300s, it's arguably the most advanced city in the world. Universities are just starting to pop up in Italy. There's nothing in England. There's nothing in France. Spain has yet to hit its Christian golden age, and it's currently at civil war between Islam and Christianity. There's a bunch of good German cities, but not on this level. Nothing in Scandinavia. Nothing in the Slavic world. The one city that might exist in the world is still Constantinople, but that was wrecked in 1204. So again, even Constantinople doesn't hold a candle to this. So there is an argument to be made that Timbuktu, for a little while, was certainly one of the most advanced cities in the world. And it's possible it was the most advanced city in the world. This depends really on what's going on in China. And just off the top of my head, I don't know if Kublai Khan is dead yet or what's going on. We don't yet have the Ming. So we might have a few cities in China that are as advanced. But that's what we're talking about. Like, when was the last time you said, Africa has the most advanced cultural learning, educational, philosophical place in the world? I bet you never thought that, and yet it was true. The first world university is in North Africa, by the way. So Mansa Musa creates a cultural golden age in West Africa. After his death, there are a series of weak kings, civil wars, the independence of vassal states. You've seen this before. This is what happens with decentralized states. The faraway places kind of start to get their independence, and Mali breaks up. In 1500, a new kingdom, Songhay, a military kingdom, takes over most of the west and the north. In 1545, Songhay sacks what's left of the Mali capital. In the 1600s, you get a kingdom called the Bamana of Jene. It's Bamana, Bamana of Jene. Djenne, and I'm probably mispronouncing both of those. That's what's going to form modern Mali, the modern kingdom of Mali, the modern state of Mali. These are a bunch of polytheists. They're not Muslims. And they're going to capture Timbuktu, and they're going to sack the Mali new capital, and they're going to absorb what was left of Mali into their kingdom. And that's where Europeans will find them about 200 years later or so. All right, that brings us to Songhai. The Songhai Empire lasts for 150 years, from 1464 to 1592. It's the biggest of our three kingdoms. It's based in a city called Goa, Gao. In the 1430s, it wins its independence from Mali. Mali is what's called a dark century, the 100 years of civil war and breakup, and where Mali just kind of falls apart. They're located on the central Sahel, so they're the furthest east of our kingdoms. Notice we've gone east. From Ghana to Mali to Songhai, we've gone east. Ghana was the most west on the Niger River. Songhai is the most east, basically based on the Sahel, and will have to invade, and conquer its way to the Niger River. It starts with a dynasty, like many of these places of a conquering founder, Soni Ali. Notice already from the name, these are African guys, but they're Muslim from the start. There's Soni Baru, who's the poor son. So Soni Ali is the conquering founder. He's Ramses II. He makes this kingdom. He's the founder. His son just can't live up to his father's image, and that's Soni Baru, Baru. And what happens is a guy named Askia, Askia, who's one of Ali's generals, usurps the son. Basically, the father dies, the son takes over. The son is, I am the son, I'm going to be a conqueror. I'm really tough. Really? Yeah, hi. My name is Billy. And this tough general just goes, yeah, no. And usurps him, kills him, and takes over the empire. And he goes on Hajj. He wants to be a little like Mansa Musa, but mostly this is a PR thing. He shows himself off to all of these kings, all of these other places, all these business associates, so that when his men show up, they're not going, hey, what happened to Soni Baru? Isn't he the king of Songhai? You're like, no, oh yeah, no, we met, we're cool, I like you. And so he goes on Hajj too, but that's a big PR thing. The Ming dynasty in China does the same thing, sends out trade expeditions all over the Indian world, basically to say, hey, don't talk to the Mongols anymore, talk to us. We're in charge of China now. So this is what Askia is doing, is saying, hey, I'm in charge of Songhai now. Don't worry about that guy Baru. He's taken care of. Just deal with me. He's got an army, a professional army. This is our first professional army that is regularly paid. It's 30,000 foot and 10,000 cavalry. Notice that the numbers, as we get older, the numbers are starting to make more sense. We went from 200,000 to 90,000 to now 30,000. And 30,000 is probably more or less where all the armies were, because you just can't feed that many people. They also built a river navy, which was unusual at the time. They built a navy for the river, for the Niger, that allowed them to dominate the Niger. And so it allowed them to be faster moving, to control cities. That cavalry, they're the first ones with cavalry. That was extremely important. Islam is their court religion. It is their form of education. It ties them in. It shows, one, that they were Islamic to start with, so they're part of the larger Islamic world. And two, by making it their court religion, it ties them into the larger world, larger trade networks, larger educational networks, larger talent pool. So collapse. Well, what happens? Well, they last the least. That's not to say they're not successful. They conquer the largest territory, but at the same time, they only last 150 years, whereas Ghana lasted 400 years. Well, what happened is Askia's sons revolted against him and then against each other. So if you live by the sword, you die by the sword type of thing. And what happened then is a Moroccan invasion with gunpowder troops. And this is one so that to break up, just like Ghana, to break up the trade monopoly over gold in the south, but also kind of to bring order. You've got 4 usurpations in one dynasty. And Morocco is fighting, at this point, fighting Spain, Christian Spain, and Christian Spain is winning. And the king of Morocco is like, I got to get this stuff organized. I don't want to be paying these high prices. And so he's got gunpowder. And so he just marches south over the Sahara. The idea is to stabilize the gold trade, put in people, put in kings he can negotiate with, better prices with, but also to be stable so that there's no more of these civil wars that are disrupting the gold trade. Morocco needs money. And so the idea is basically like, you know how when you're driving in a car and you're fighting with your brother and sister in the back seat and your dad turns around and says, "Don't make me stop this car. Don't make me stop it, or I'm gonna finish this." And you're like, "Oh, but he started it. I don't care who started it. I'm gonna finish this." That's what Morocco does. Basically, I'm gonna bring order to this mess. So what are the effects of the West African kingdoms on the world? The first is that Islam spread in Eastern and Western Africa, and that equaled modernity. Islam was modernity. And you have to understand, at least until 1258, 1300, 1400, Islam is the most advanced civilization around in the Mediterranean basin. Certainly until at least the destruction from 600 to 1256, it is certainly the most advanced. There's then a couple of hundred years of the Turks kind of running the Middle East. You know, they're still as good. So they pick up the cultural golden age. And so you could make an argument to 1500, 1600, Islam is still the most advanced educational place on earth, at least till 1400, at least till the discovery of the New World. And all that money comes pouring into Europe. At least until then, Islam is modernity. The Middle Ages in Europe, the Dark Ages in Europe are nothing, right? And China has some great periods, the Tang, the Ming, and even the Mongol period, Yuan. But there's also wars in between that just wreck China. You know, the Mongolian wars killed 30 million people. And so China might have higher highs, but also lower lows. African kingdoms, this is part 2. Number 2, African kingdoms equal wealth, trade, education, urbanization. You get Goa, Timbuktu, and Meroe. These are great cities on any order. Timbuktu holds a candle, holds no one's jacket in education for much of the Middle Ages. Arabic and European slavery affected the coasts, but not the kingdoms. But African kingdoms had slavery, and they would enslave interior populations. So if you lived in one of these strong kingdoms, you did not get turned into a slave. But if you lived in a weak kingdom, if you lived in a vassal state, if you lived in a place in the periphery, you very well could be turned into a slave. These kingdoms on the coast were tied to larger world economic units. Those world economic units needed slaves, whether it's the Middle East or the New World. And the kingdoms were perfectly willing to enslave people, fellow Africans, but they didn't see them as fellow other Africans, and for a good price sell them to the Europeans or to the Middle Easterners. There's not a lot of Middle Eastern, like Arabs, coming to Africa to capture their own slaves, nor are there a lot of Europeans doing the same thing. They don't have to. There's these kingdoms that are strong kingdoms that are willing to do it for them. African kingdoms, so this is number 4, African kingdoms grew up connected to the European and Middle Eastern worlds with a connected economy, connected religions, and connected cultures. They are part of the racism that comes in the imperialism of the Victorians, of the 1900s, is that Africa is a bunch of villages, poor villages that have never been connected to the world. And that's just bull. It's just wrong. Most of the civilizations of Eastern and Western Africa are tied. They're at the end of these strings. They're at the end of trade routes. right? It takes Mansa Musa a long time to go on Hajj, but he could go on Hajj. Where the Europeans were like, oh, we don't know anything about this, so you people must suck. It's just racism. It's all it is. And we'll talk about that in History 1 too, of how the Europeans invent racism. But they totally ignore, Europeans totally ignore the connections of these places to the Islamic world. They think the Islamic world is their enemy, and inferior because they're racist. So they think Africa is inferior and racist. And so they missed what is this glorious kingdom that used to be connected to the Roman world. They have completely, by 1600, Europeans had completely forgotten that the African world had once been connected to the Roman and Greek world. So much so that when academics start writing, there's a book called Black Athens, which stunned America back in the 90s. I remember the author being on Oprah, and the idea was, his argument was, whether it's right or wrong, but it's an argument that has a historical relevance, it's possible, was that the Africans had a long history, East Africa had a long history of trade and culture and contact with Egypt. The Greeks borrowed a lot of stuff from the Egyptians. Some of that stuff, the Greeks flat out say we took this stuff from Egypt. Some of that stuff had to have been, by definition, African, because African Kushite kings ruled Egypt for 100 years. Culture had been going back and forth for 3,000 years. There is certainly African stuff in Egypt that the Greeks will take. The Greeks then spread that. Athens then spreads that Egyptian African cultural stuff. And then the Romans conquer Athens and Greece and then spread Athenian culture everywhere. Meaning that European culture is at its base part African. And that is like blowing the minds of every racist white dude out there. That European culture, which is considered the best, is actually might be part African. It's certainly part African. There is no doubt it's part African. It's Jewish, Judeo-Christian, Roman, Greek, but it's also Middle Eastern, Semitic, and African. It takes influences from all over. And that's where we're going to end. Thank you.